Greetings and welcome to the lecture in this NPTEL course on 20th century poetry. In the previous lecture, I offered a brief introduction to Langston Hughes, and I spent some time discussing the differences between two literary and cultural genres. On one hand, the elegy, with its associations of somewhat elite English educated uh, culture, and the blues with its association of vernacular African American culture. We will continue that discussion and get in depth into Hughes's writing with some poems from Hughes's first collection. I ended the previous lecture by discussing the position taken by a contemporary of Hughes, an African American writer named Countee Cullens. For Cullens, the position of the blues singer was that of someone who transformed grief into a melody. This was a skill that was not imaginable for Cullen the poet. Hughes, on the other hand, chose a different path. This path was almost diametrically opposed to that of Cullen. While Cullen viewed the poet and the blues singer as being somewhat different, as being on different or opposing poles of a kind of dialogue or debate, Hughes viewed the singer and the poet as more similar. For Hughes, the poet and the singer were in a reciprocal relationship. And we will see this in the title poem of Hughes's first collection, The Weary Blues, which we will study in detail a little bit later. Hughes's first collection was titled The Weary Blues, and this inaugurated a new relationship between these constellations of ideas that we've been tracking thus far. On one hand, there's racial violence. There is the experience of inequality, violence that people from the African American ethnicity and community suffered. On the other hand, there is poetic convention. There is the history of the elegy. There is the way in which elegy has been written by canonical poets. And finally, there is the necessity of a language in which mourning and melancholia can be performed collectively. This third one is a very important category. Mourning and melancholia, as we discussed in the very beginning of this course, are categories that were first put forward by the Austrian psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud. It was later used by the English literary scholar Peter Sachs in his discussion of the genre of the elegy. According to Sachs, the traditional elegy represented a kind of transition from melancholia, which in Freud's view represents unhealthy or a kind of pathological mourning or pathological grieving, to mourning, which in Freud's view represents healthy or normal grieving. So for Peter Sachs, one of the earliest theorists of the elegy is a literary genre that enables the transition from unhealthy or pathological to healthier or so-called normal forms of grieving. This view was complicated by Ramazani, who argued that all mourning is somewhat melancholic, and therefore the elegy can be understood more profitably as something that doesn't simply describe the transition from unhealthy to healthy grieving, but which demonstrates the possibility inherent in all grieving to be both healthy and unhealthy. That is to say, melancholic mourning is what truly helps us understand the power and the motivation of the genre called the elegy. This was Ramazani. Now, in this whole conversation, if we can understand that the elegy is a genre that allows for richer, more complex, more human, more holistic forms of grieving that are not contained by outdated norms or outdated definitions of what counts as healthy or unhealthy grieving. If the elegy is a genre that truly has the power to describe simply human beings in grief, human beings suffering because of the loss of another human being, if that is truly the definition of the elegy, then there must be a form or a way in which the elegy can describe the mourning and the melancholia, not just of one person, but that of a community. And in the case of the African American community, and in the case of the history of this community in the early 20th century, that collective mourning, a collective mourning which was both mourning and melancholia, a collective grieving, which had the complexity of both mourning and melancholia. It was necessary to conduct that collective act of grieving with forms of melancholia and mourning built into it. There was a necessity for a literary form which could allow for this complex collective act of grieving. All of this came together only when Hughes was able to combine the kind of potential that the blues songs had with what the elegy as a literary and poetic medium offered. Indeed, Ramazani's claim is that the blues poems, as written by Hughes, represents the most sophisticated adaptation of African American culture and society to the elegy. That is to say, Hughes adapts a very popular and cultural form to a somewhat educated elite literary form. The situation of the elegy within classical European and canonical English literature is not a problem, but it becomes an advantage because it produces a new kind of conversation. It enables a new kind of public collective grieving. Okay, in order to understand how this became possible, we need to know how the blues were received, practiced, and consumed. Now, the first thing to note is that the blues are not the only Black or African American cultural form which has been used to articulate the racially determined suffering inflicted on and experienced by African American people. Perhaps the oldest such form is the spiritual. The spiritual were songs composed during the Middle Passage, that is, the mass enslavement and transportation of Africans to the Americas as property. The scholar W.E.B. Du Bois calls these spirituals sorrow songs, and he examined how people and a community as a whole developed a mode of singing and writing in order to cope with the experiences of unprecedented suffering. In these songs, the pain is sought to be transcended by spiritual or heavenly resolution. So in most of these spirituals, the sorrow songs, in W.E.B. Du Bois's words, follow a structure which, at the end of which, God or some sort of a divine spiritual power takes back and heals the African souls who in their bodily existence underwent undeserved, unspeakable, tragic suffering. As such, the spirituals have a structure which is not too dissimilar to the structure of the classical elegy. Like the classical elegy as written by Milton, the spirituals allow for consolation. In fact, they don't only allow for consolation, but the whole point is consolation. This consolation can be defined as any means through which the pain and the grief is resolved through an external agent. God, like nature in the classical elegy, steps in to temper the poet's grief. Now, in this sense, the blues are different because they create a unique kind of verbal space. The blues allow the speaker to express unspeakable grief, pain, and tragedy. And after expressing these things, grief, pain, and tragedy, to remain disconsolate, that is, to refuse traditional or conventional forms of resolution to that pain. Now, the differences between elegy and blues are obvious. One is verbal, one is oral. That is, the blues are oral. They are sung, recited, right? They have to be spoken and heard. Elegies are written and read. It's a silent conversation. One is elite, one is popular. That is, Elegies are written by educated, accomplished users of the English language and read and appreciated by people who can understand that highly sophisticated use of the English language. Blues are popular. Blues are performed by working class, mostly black people, and appreciated, received, consumed by others who share some of their concerns as well as their economic and social background. Despite these two differences, there are many similarities as well. Both are based on antiphony, that is, both are performances that have a call and answer structure. The blues involve a dialogue between a bar band and customers. The elegy involves a group of shepherds calling to each other, mourning the loss of one of their own. So, in both of these contexts, there is a call and answer. The singer calls, the audience communicates, and the singer answers the call. And perhaps the biggest difference between the two genres is that they deal with different kinds of subject matter. Now, the elegy is very clearly about a very specific form of loss, the death of a person who is considered very close to the speaker of the poem. The blues, on the other hand, are about loss, and they are often about this very specific loss, that is, the death of a person who is close to the poet or the speaker, but they are also about other kinds of loss. Blues songs range very widely in the kinds of losses they describe. What kinds of losses qualify for description in blues songs? There is lost love, there's lost friendship, there's lost money, there's lost work, there's lost self-esteem also, and so on and so forth. We'll now look at some popular and influential scholarly positions on the meaning of the blues. Okay? In his book-length work, Blues People, the African-American scholar Amiri Baraka, who earlier went by the name Leroy Jones, argues that the blues have been kept alive by the poor and working class African American people, despite not being liked, or in fact, despite being dismissed by middle class, educated, and respectable African Americans. So, Baraka argues that in the middle of the 20th century, there was a clear tension between how different African Americans viewed the blues. Those from the working class and those who were very clearly disadvantaged economically, they seemed to appreciate the blues. Whereas those who had received some education and had moved on, had moved up the social ladder, they did not care that much for the blues. This is an important distinction for Baraka, and Baraka has a theory for why this is so. According to Baraka, the blues remain popular among the poor and working class blacks because they contain some essential truths about 3 centuries of slavery. This history means that the African American experience is governed by, and I quote from Baraka now, its attendant muses of self-division, self-hatred, stoicism, and quixotic optimism. Unquote. These 4 qualities, according to Baraka, which determine the experience of life from which African American music emerged. Okay, so let us try and understand this claim. According to Baraka, there is a particular history which determines the life of African American people in the US. This history involves slavery, brutal violence. It also involves emancipation, that is the legal abolition of slavery. It also involves other forms of social segregation, which happened in the Jim Crow era. It involves the mass incarceration of Black people. It involves experiences like lynching, which is practiced in the Deep South in American South, in Southern American states like Mississippi, uh, Georgia, so on. These experiences produce some very dominant qualities, some very dominant emotions. And for Baraka, there are four dominant emotions. There is self-division. Self-division refers to feeling divided, feeling that one is uh, pulled in different directions by opposing allegiances. The best way to understand this self-division is to look at the term African American. Uh, African American is a very modern term. It emerged out of the history of the Harlem Renaissance. It was a term that was given by several scholars of race because they tried to describe how the experience of a black person in 20th century US was a very divided and alienated experience. Because on one hand, the average black person felt a sense of affinity, a sense of connection to Africa. But on the other hand, the sense of affinity and the sense of belonging was not real. In fact, there was no material basis to develop that sense of belonging because life in contemporary America was determined by the experiences, the perspectives, and the cultural education of white people. So there was both white and black in African American. So there's a constant self-division in the existence of the average black person in America. This is the first dominant emotion. The second is self-hatred. In order to succeed, in order to rise up the social and economic ladder, African American people have to take on some of the ways of white people. And they have to, in some way, disown and profess to be detached from their African lineage. So this produces a kind of self-hatred, kind of unconscious self-hatred, a kind of contempt for the African heritage that has shaped so many of these people. This is the second dominant emotion. The third dominant emotion is that of stoicism. That is, the ability to suffer but not give voice to that suffering. The ability to silently endure hardships and to keep doing one's work in order to educate oneself, to get a job, to provide for one's family, and so on. This is the third dominant emotion that structures the African American experience. And the fourth is quixotic optimism. That is, having abolished slavery. The legal abolition of slavery produced a kind of freedom for African American people, the opportunity to pursue the American dream. This opportunity existed in theory only, however, because in actual reality, the dominant white governments of several American states found ways to reinforce the racial inequality from the times of slavery. So slavery continued in other forms. Even though it was legally banned, the Jim Crow era found that several states enacted laws which continued to make life difficult, which continued to reduce opportunities for African American people. So the pursuit of the American dream remained a kind of quixotic optimism, that is romantic, not realistic, excessively idealistic. Okay, so these four dominant emotions shaped the African American experience, and it was this experience which fed directly into the kind of music that made the blues songs. This was the theory of blues people, the title of the book, and this is the theory of blues music provided by the scholar Amiri Baraka, who earlier went by the name Leroy Jones before his conversion. Now, this is one position, but several black writers and scholars do not find Baraka's theory very persuasive. Richard Wright and Ralph Ellison are two very, very famous, well-known black writers who argued that the blues represented not this kind of suffering, this kind of tragedy, but in fact the transcendence of the Afro-American subject from the darkness of slavery. So, from the perspective of Richard Wright and Ralph Ellison, Baraka's thesis that African American people continue to write the blues and sing the blues and enjoy the blues because they are constantly subjugated, because they are constantly suffering racial violence. That theory appears to require a kind of stagnation. So, according to from this perspective, Baraka's thesis is an unnecessary wallowing of the black poet or the black blues singer in experiences of pain, suffering, and grief. Instead, Wright and Ellison offer something that resembles an optimism, not a fake optimism, not a quixotic optimism, as Baraka put it, but a genuine transcendence, a genuine upliftment of the African American community, and a genuine end to the kind of physical and social suffering that slavery and Jim Crow produced. Now, Langston Hughes disagreed with Wright and Ellison and aligned his own position somewhere between these two, but a little bit closer to Baraka's. So Hughes did not believe that blues music meant that African American people would universally and eternally be in suffering. He did not quite share that level of pessimism, but he did believe that the blues music spoke very universally and very powerfully to the experience of being African American. So Hughes found in the blues not a wallowing, but instead an opportunity, a chance to produce a new way of writing poems, a new way of articulating the undeniable, ambivalent, and necessary truths of the African American existence in 20th century America. Now, let us examine what Hughes's position was by looking at some of his statements about spirituals, blues, and and the way different genres communicate the particular form of sadness that emerges from the experience of being African American in the 20th century. So, in 1925, here is what Hughes wrote about the blues, and I quote: "The blues always impressed me as being very sad, sadder even than the spirituals, because their sadness is not softened with tears, but hardened with laughter. The absurd, incongruous laughter of a sadness without even a god to appeal to." So this is Hughes, and it is the beginning of a series of positions in which the blues are a form of writing in which sadness continues, in which sadness survives, but it is not hopeless. It is not full of despair. It is a sadness that appears to be hopeless, but because of its fixity, because of its stability, because of its certainty, it offers the speaker a chance of redemption. This is Hughes in 1925. He would say, he would make frequent statements about the meaning of the blues, but among his memorable positions is something he wrote in the year 1940. And I quote from Hughes again: "The spirituals are escape songs, looking toward heaven, tomorrow, and God. But the blues are today songs, here and now, broke and broken-hearted, when you're troubled in mind and don't know what to do and nobody cares." So again, it sounds like what Hughes is attracted to in the blues is a kind of description or a kind of writing and singing that emerges from a state of being utterly hopeless. And this is coming from the words I just read out. Blues are today's songs. The blues ideally describe the state of mind of a person who is broke and broken-hearted, troubled in mind, doesn't know what to do, and nobody cares. So while it appears to be a state of utter hopelessness and despair, there is hope because despite being in a position that appears to be hopeless, the singer is still making music. The poet is still writing poetry. And it is in the act of turning a hopeless situation into an opportunity to write that there lies some hope. It sounds a bit complicated, but we will see exactly how Hughes turns the apparent hopelessness of blues into the hope of poetry very shortly. Now, a very important statement about Hughes's position on the blues appeared in his second collection of poems titled Fine Clothes for Jews. This collection was published in the year 1927, and it began with a prefatory essay called Note on Blues. In this very brief essay, Hughes wrote that his songs, his poems are written after the manner of those Negro folk songs, and that there was a fundamental tension between laughter and sadness in these folk songs. In Hughes's words, the dominant tone of these folk songs is that of despondency, but when they are sung, people always laugh. So Hughes is not rejecting what Du Bois, Ellison, and Wright, as well as several other scholars, had noted about the transcendence and resolution in the blues. For Hughes, it's not that there is no transcendence, it's not that there is no hope, but Hughes is saying that in order to get to transcendence, first one must spend an adequate amount of time in the troughs and the valleys of despair. That is, one must spend some time in the complete and utter hopelessness of the blues. And it is from this complete hopelessness that the transcendence can emerge. So the transcendence or the hope that Ellison and Wright talk about cannot come from outside the speaker or outside the context of the African American experience. The hope has to be created by the speaker, by the poet, and by the blues singer. This is Hughes's position, and we can get a chance to understand how Hughes uses this position to produce a new kind of poetry. What Hughes's blues singers demonstrate is the depth of their grief. It is very deep, and by choosing to stagnate, that is, by choosing to refuse consolation, by choosing to wallow, live inside, and create songs in that grief, Hughes's blues singers refuse to be pulled out of it. And they demonstrate that this refusal to be pulled out of grief, refusal to be consoled by a transcendent hope from outside, is actually a reasonable choice. And wallowing or staying inside grief is as good as accepting consolation and hope. Wallowing inside grief is as reasonable as transcending grief through religion, social justice, or material success. We will stop here. We have had a thorough introduction to the cultural differences between different narratives that were available to the African American poet. And we have also seen different positions taken by scholars, writers, novelists, and poets with regard to both the experience of racial inequality as well as how that experience can be treated in different linguistic and cultural registers. After this, in the subsequent lectures, we will undertake a detailed study and close reading of some poems by Langston Hughes. Thank you.